Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to present today. I'm sorry that I cannot be there in person, but delighted to have this opportunity to be with you virtually, at least, and to talk about this work on advancing health, religion, and spirituality research. And really, what I'm going to focus on in this presentation is sort of synthesis, evidence synthesis, and a movement towards knowledge, a movement from kind of research to what is it that we really know and what sort of evidence do we need. So I'll make some few initial remarks with regard to what I think we know at present and how as I see it, the evidence on religion and spirituality and health and well-being has progressed. I'll then move to questions of gaps in our knowledge, where the research perhaps isn't yet entirely definitive. And then I'll talk about some current and ongoing work on trying to address those knowledge gaps. For those who do want a little bit of methodology, I think I have 3 or 4 slides on methodologic approaches for outcome-wide studies, which I do think can help advance knowledge more quickly. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but since one of my other hats at Harvard really is on methodology, I'll make at least a few remarks because, again, I do think it's important to advance knowledge on this topic as well. I'll also talk about, I think, an additional data resource, which I think can help advance knowledge on spirituality, religion, and health, and that's the Global Flourishing Study, which, as I'll discuss a little bit later, is an open access data resource, so you all could make use of it as well. But I'll talk about some of the initial results on religion and spirituality and health and well-being and what more might be done in the years ahead. And then finally, I'll conclude with some discussion of public health and clinical implications of this work and of what we really know already. So there's been a huge amount of research on religion, spirituality, and health, and Harold Koenig's third edition of the Handbook on Religion and Health, which I had the pleasure and honor of participating in as an editor. But really, this is, Harold Koenig's uh, um, creation, and it is an extraordinary volume. But they report over 10,000 quantitative studies relating spirituality and religion and health. So there's been a lot of research. But with all this research, what is it that we actually know? What is kind of beyond any reasonable doubt, and where do we only just have evidence which might not yet be conclusive? Um, and what is it? I'll be asking, what is it that justifies a claim to knowledge? That we don't just have evidence, but we actually know something. We know that it's true. What justifies that? And what is it that we know on this topic of spirituality, religion, and its causal relationship potentially to health? What are the current gaps in our knowledge, and how might we expand that knowledge, that evidence, more quickly? So I guess now a bit of an aside with regard to, what is it that we even mean by knowledge? And I'd say if we turn to Plato, his definition of knowledge was true justified belief. There has been some contemporary discussion on why that might not go quite far enough to constitute knowledge. And I think a re-rendering of Plato's discussion, which I think brings us somewhat closer, is true justified belief, the evidence for which cannot be overturned. So yes, it's true. Yes, we have justification for it. Yes, we believe it. But also, as we look at the evidence, there's no way to explain the evidence other than that belief that we hold, that justification is in fact secure. So I think there's a question: to what extent have we attained not just research, but to what extent have we attained knowledge with regard to the potentially causal relationships between spirituality and religion on the one hand, and health and well-being on the other? What is it that we know? Where is it the case that our evidence simply cannot be overturned? And I do think there are challenges here because a large majority of the research on spirituality, religion, and health remains cross-sectional, where all the data has been collected at a single point in time. And so it's very difficult to then work out causality. So, for example, religious participation is associated with lower rates of depression. But is that relationship, is that association causal case that the case that those who become depressed are more likely to leave their religious communities and other forms of community life. And with cross-sectional data, we simply cannot tell. And so I think it's important that when we evaluate the research literature, we distinguish between different strengths of our various research designs. Different designs allow for greater robustness to potential confounding and robustness to this potential of reverse causation as well, that it might be the case that depression causes declines in religious service attendance rather than that religious service attendance protects against depression. So at the lowest levels, really cross-sectional studies, when all the data is collected at once, it's very difficult to discern between association and causation. We don't know which direction causality might run. Somewhat stronger than that are longitudinal or cohort studies. Follow up with adjustment for a rich set of baseline confounders. At least then we have temporal separation. Stronger than that is when we're able to control for the baseline outcome as well. So we would ideally like to look at the association between religious service attendance and subsequent depression at a different time while controlling for baseline religious service attendance and then a host of other confounding factors as well. If we're able to control for baseline depression in addition to service attendance, that baseline outcome, then that helps rule out reverse causation because we've controlled for the other direction. And I really, to my mind, that's kind of the lowest level where we begin to claim causal evidence. The other levels might be helpful with regard to hypothesis generating, but in terms of when we begin to have at least a little bit of causal evidence, I think it's that those longitudinal cohort studies with control for confounding and baseline outcome. Somewhat stronger still are studies where we can look at changes in exposure, so changes in religious service attendance over time, and that association with subsequent outcome, subsequent depression, controlling again for rich confounders. Better yet still is when we can look at a whole trajectory of changes in our exposure in religious service attendance and our outcome depression. And of course, the gold standard for establishing causation is a randomized trial. But often with matters of religion and spirituality, we can't randomize. We can't randomize religious beliefs. It would arguably be somewhat unethical to try to force religious service attendance in a randomized trial. So often we are stuck with observational studies. But I mean, ideally, we want these stronger study designs. And ideally, further, we want not just one or two studies, but a whole host of studies with different populations, perhaps different follow-up periods, and then meta-analyses of these more rigorous longitudinal studies to establish causation, to establish the strongest possible evidence. And so I'll be asking this question: where do we have meta-analyses in the religion and health literature of longitudinal studies, not just cross-sectional, but longitudinal studies with control for baseline outcome? To what extent have we established evidence at that level? And then I'll come to this question: is that level sufficient really for knowledge even? And I think there have been, a couple of critical moments in the evolution of this literature. I will begin my remarks with a focus on religious service attendance, and then I'll broaden the discussion somewhat to other aspects of religion and spirituality, including belief and spiritual practices and prayer and meditation and so on and so forth. But I think we've got the strongest evidence at present for religious service attendance, for participation in religious community. And as I said, this literature is huge. It's accumulated over time. There have been a number of important papers over the past several decades, at least for pretty good studies, even starting in the 1970s. Many weak studies as well, but some stronger studies, even from the 1970s onwards. And I do think a major step forward was Harold Koenig's publication of Harold Koenig's first edition, and in fact each subsequent edition of his handbook on religion and health, kind of gathering, summarizing the evidence. But there had been meta-analyses by this point as well, but not meta-analyses of longitudinal studies with control for baseline outcome. And I think the first major step forward in this regard was this meta-analysis by Cheetah et al. In 2009, showing restricting to longitudinal data, controlling for baseline health, and looking at associations between religious service attendance and all-cause mortality, and finding for those who attended services weekly versus not at all, there was about, I think it was 27% reduction in all-cause mortality over follow-up confidence interval, 16% to 37%. And I think really at that point, we had pretty strong evidence. And I'll come back to this question: did we really know it? Did we really know that the effect of service attendance on mortality was causal at that point? But this I think was a major step forward with regard to the evidence. So that was 2009. Harold Koenig's second edition was published in 2012, and I remember going through the handbook maybe a year or two later and thinking, oh, I mean, the evidence for an effect on depression also seems very strong from the studies described here, which was maybe a little bit more ambiguous with the first edition. It took some years still until there was a meta-analysis of longitudinal studies with control baseline outcome. Plenty of other meta-analyses on religion, spirituality, and mental health, but often including cross-sectional studies, which again, I think muddies the water with regard to trying to establish causation. So this paper by Garson et al. In 2021 conducted a meta-analysis of religious service attendance and other religion and spirituality exposures with mental health, and one of their analyses really focused on depression. And I think this provided evidence and meta-analysis of rigorous longitudinal studies of about a 33% reduction in the odds of depression over follow-up. And then in 2024, the third edition of Harold Koenig's handbook was published, which I think made clear that there were many other high-quality studies and many other outcomes. And so some of what we really needed to do now was meta-analysis, but perhaps meta-analysis accompanied by a systematic review. Harold Koenig's handbook has almost an encyclopedic overview of the literature, but not necessarily systematic insofar as the criteria for which studies are included or not are perhaps less clear. But I think we've reached a point, possibly around the time of these meta-analyses, possibly a little bit later, where we can make pretty strong claims for causation. And so we have this meta-analytic evidence of rigorous longitudinal studies. It's not just one, it's not just two, it's dozens of studies suggesting the same thing. And when we synthesize over these studies, suggesting notable effects on all-cause mortality and on depression. But the evidence is stronger than that as well. In addition to these longitudinal studies and the meta-analyses of longitudinal studies, these associations are quite robust to potential unmeasured confounding. And I'll come back to this point a little bit later, but if you use sensitivity analysis techniques to ask how strong would unmeasured confounding have to be, maybe personality, say, has affected both service attendance and depression, for example, the associations would have to be extremely strong with an unmeasured confounder to explain away what we've observed. And I'll talk a little bit later about methods to do this well, but if you use these techniques for these and apply them to the meta-analyses of rigorous longitudinal studies, you think probably can't be explained away by unmeasured confounding, especially after the rich control for measured confounding that's already been made. So that strengthens the evidence further. I think strengthen the evidence yet further is that we also now have an understanding of the mechanisms. So in addition to evidence for an effect, we know something about how religious service attendance might affect all-cause mortality. Some of this is through social support, which we've known for decades has effects on subsequent mortality risk. Some of it's through health behaviors, through lowering smoking, for example, subsequently, and we know that that affects mortality risk. Some of it's through lowering depression. Some of it's through hope and optimism. Some of it's through purpose. And so we have an understanding now, not just of the associations and evidence that they're causal, but of the mechanisms as well. And lastly, there's now evidence from quasi-experimental designs, instrumental variable designs, using very different assumptions that have suggested the same thing, looking at, for example, how exposure to students in one's class who might be religious might help get other students to attend services as well, and how that affects their depression outcomes. So very, very different designs that a lot of economists and other social scientists like to use, likewise suggest the same thing. So I think for at least the exposure of religious service attendance and the outcomes of all-cause mortality and depression, the evidence is really difficult to overturn at present. I think we can, in fact, make claims not just of evidence and research, but of knowledge. Can we say more? We've got over 10,000 studies. Is there more that we can say? And again, there evidence for plenty of other outcomes from rigorous longitudinal studies, not just on all-cause mortality and depression, but also suicide, life satisfaction, meaning and purpose, effects on less substance abuse, less crime, greater generosity and volunteering and civic engagement, higher levels of happiness and well-being. It's quite a list of outcomes, but in some cases there are only one or two rigorous studies. In other cases, perhaps uh, dozens. So I think there's in some ways more to do with regard to evidence synthesis. And so I think another important step forward with regard to evidence synthesis, not just providing evidence, and many studies that are really good, high quality, rigorous, continue to come out, but in terms of moving towards knowledge and that evidence synthesis, and I think another important step forward was this systematic review published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2020, led by my colleague Tracy Balboni. But this was a major review of the literature on religion, spirituality, and health from 2000 to 2022. Over those 2 years, over nearly 9,000 abstracts were reviewed for role of spirituality and religion in serious illness, and about 6,500 for looking at the role of religion and spirituality in health outcomes. And pretty strict inclusion criteria were used so as to focus on the most rigorous studies, the most rigorous evidence, including large sample sizes, validated measures, and for the health outcomes, a longitudinal design with control for baseline outcomes. So the systematic review restricted for the health outcomes to studies which had sample sizes of at least 1,000, were longitudinal in design and controlled for baseline outcomes. So this was a huge amount of work over several years with a very large research team, but I think led to several important insights. So this was a systematic review accompanied by a Delphi panel on the interpretation of evidence. Some of the conclusions that were rated by the Delphi panel as having very strong evidence were that in the context of serious illness, which I'm only going to briefly comment on, I'll come back to this a little bit later as well. I'm going to focus mostly on religious service attendance and health outcomes, but with regard to serious illness, evidence that spirituality is in fact important to most patients, that spiritual needs are common in serious illness and end of life, that spiritual care is frequently desired by patients, but that those spiritual needs are infrequently met in medical care, even in end of life settings where best practices are to include such care. They're generally not been given. Spirituality can play an important role in medical decision making, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. Uh, but that unaddressed spiritual needs are associated with poor quality of life, and that provision of spiritual care is associated with better quality of life. So these were some of the results that emerged from the systematic review and Delphi panel concerning the literature on serious illness with regard to health outcomes for general populations. From the systematic review, pretty strong evidence that religious service attendance, weekly attendance, was associated with lower mortality risk, less smoking, alcohol, and drug use, better mental health, better quality of life, fewer subsequent depressive symptoms, and fewer suicidal behaviors. So I think this was a major advance in evidence synthesis. What this systematic review did not do was provide a meta-analysis, and so that's kind of some of the work that hoping to carry out soon, which and are carrying out, which I'll describe. I'll come back to implications of this work a little bit later and tackle this in full. But coming out of this paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association. These were kind of recommendations put forward by majority consensus, and the Delphi panel were three for serious illness, three for health outcomes. For serious illness, highest ranking was that uh, patients should routinely incorporate spiritual care and into the medical care of those patients with serious illness. The evidence is pretty overwhelming that this would be a good thing to do. Second, spiritual care education should be included in the training of members of interdisciplinary medical teams caring for seriously ill patients. One of the strongest predictors of provision of care was of spiritual care was having received training in it. And the provision of training was very low. Only about 15% had received training. So that was the second highest ranked recommendation. And the third highest is include specialty practitioners, chaplains, for example, or maybe social workers with training in spiritual care, pastors, and so on, in the care of patients with serious illness. With regard to health outcomes, recommendations were incorporate patient-centered and evidence-based approaches regarding the beneficial associations of religious and spiritual community participation to improve medical care and population health. And this is a sensitive topic. I don't want to pretend it's easy, and I'll come back to this at the end, as to how to do this well and how to do this ethically and in a sensitive way. But that was, from this Delphi panel, the number one recommended proposal. Second, increase awareness among public health professionals of the evidence of protective health associations of religious spiritual community. And third, recognize spirituality as a social factor associated with health in research and community assessments and in program implementation. More could and should be said on this, and again, I'll come back to these matters at the end of my presentation. So again, what do we know? I do think this the existing studies, the research, and the most rigorous studies and the systematic review of them have provided pretty strong evidence. I think we can go further. I think we need to carry out meta-analyses on some of these topics and evaluate robustness to unmeasured confounding as well. And I think the systematic review and also Harold Koenig's handbook on religion and health have made clear that there is now sufficient number of rigorous longitudinal studies to carry out meta-analyses restricted to those longitudinal studies for a number of other health outcomes, including drug use, alcohol use and abuse, and smoking, suicide and suicide behaviors, cardiovascular disease, and life satisfaction. And well-being. And so in a current Templeton Religion Trust project, we're trying to carry out meta-analyses on these topics, sort of using the results of that systematic review, but now turning this into quantitative analysis. And I do think this evidence synthesis through meta-analysis is powerful, is helpful, and can be a helpful corrective. We've done this now for drug use, alcohol use, and smoking. That paper's not yet published, but the analyses are complete. And one does, as I had anticipated, given the literature, find an effect. But it was, I confess, also smaller than I had anticipated. I had thought that these were amongst the most strongly affected outcomes, and one finds pretty consistent effect across almost all studies. Effect sizes do vary. But in the meta-analyses, it suggested about a 20% reduction. In my read of the literature, I would have guessed maybe 30, 35, maybe even 40%. So it was, in some ways, a helpful corrective to me, which is why one wants to carry out these meta-analyses. So now we're doing this with suicide, with cardiovascular disease, with life satisfaction and well-being. And I think the results for cardiovascular disease will be quite interesting. This is still a disputed topic in the literature. There are many, including Harold Koenig, who thinks there are real effects on cardiovascular disease. I tend to be more skeptical. I think there's effects on cardiovascular disease survival. But I'm not sure about incidence of cardiovascular disease. So again, this is why we carry out the meta-analyses, to try to correct our perceptions and biases with a synthesis of the evidence in the literature. So I think these meta-analyses will constitute important further steps towards knowledge. We could perhaps still dispute with some of these. Do we have knowledge yet that service attendance causally affects these outcomes? I think the case is pretty compelling, but could be made yet stronger with these meta-analyses, which we're trying to do now. So we do have some knowledge. I think we can expand that further. I mean, given that we've got 10,000 studies, surely there should be more that we can claim that we truly know, not just evidence, not just research, but we know the evidence cannot be overturned. And I think we should do this for exposures beyond religious service attendance, other aspects of religion and spirituality. And I know you've had uh, um, Daryl von Tongeren present on probably perhaps for forgiveness and compargament on spiritual coping, and so I think there's strong evidence for many of these other religious and spiritual exposures. We should be moving towards knowledge there as well. But what do we know for other religious and spiritual exposures? Um, what about other health and well-being outcomes? And also, what about kind of non-Western, non-Christian contexts? Even these more rigorous meta-analyses are mostly restricted, not exclusively, but mostly concern Western and populations, and thus predominantly, though again, not exclusively Christian populations. So, what about other settings? We need to interpret our meta-analyses properly and contextually do these same patterns? Can we claim these same causal effects in other contexts? And given how long it's taken to establish what I would argue is the knowledge that we do have, can we advance that knowledge more rapidly? And so that's what I'm going to discuss now. I'll discuss use of methodologically outcome-wide studies to more rapidly advance knowledge. I'll discuss incorporation of broader flourishing measures into our work to look at not just health, but also well-being outcomes. And I'll talk about a new data resource, the Global Flourishing Study, that might help advance this work. Uh, so the basic idea of an outcome-wide study, which I put forward in a short paper in 2017 and kind of provided a fuller exposition in 2020 in this paper at the bottom of the slide. The idea is pretty simple. It's to fix an exposure at a particular point in time and control for a host of confounders. Um, but look not just at the associations with one outcome over time, but a whole host, maybe 50, 60 outcomes all at once. And so the basic idea is simple, but in a single paper, you regress the first outcome on the exposure, religious service attendance, say, and a whole host of covariates, confounding variables. And then you do that for the second outcome, and then the third outcome. You repeat that regression. You use the same design, but then you report associations with a whole host of outcomes. And this has the advantage of more quickly publishing results and advancing our evidence. And also it makes it much easier to publish null associations, which are important to know about as well, but are difficult to publish in the literature. When you're publishing 50 outcomes at once and you only have evidence for effects on 6 outcomes, you can still publish the null results on 44 other outcomes, whereas it would take nearly a lifetime to publish 44 null result papers if you tried to do this one by one. So that's the basic idea. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but there are some further complexities. How do we choose our confounding variables? And I think in these outcome-wide studies, probably the best thing to do is to choose a very rich set of confounding variables because you're looking at a bunch of different outcomes. So really any potential cause of the exposure or any potential cause of any of the outcomes, I would argue, should be included as confounders. Ideally, they would occur the wave before the exposure. So if we collected data on religious service attendance in 1996, then maybe try to get the confounders in 95 or 1994 so that we can distinguish between confounders and mediators. Ideally, also control for all of those outcomes, those same outcomes that we're looking at, but at the pre-exposure, the pre-baseline level. Again, exposure is 96, control for the outcomes in 1994. Say doing this well will require large sample sizes in the thousands, but again, can move the work forward more quickly. I commented on this earlier, but I think also in our observational studies, in our meta-analyses, and in these outwide studies as well, it's helpful to assess the robustness of one's associations to potential unmeasured confounding. And this can be done in a fairly straightforward way with a measure that I introduced about 8 years ago now in the Annals of Internal Medicine called the E-value. The E-value is simply the minimum strength of association on a risk ratio scale that an unmeasured confounder would need to have with both the exposure and the outcome to explain away the effect estimate. So if you let RRUY be the association, and this will kind of be the most substantial methodologic aside, but I hope this technique might be helpful to some of you in your own research. So if we let RRUY be the maximum risk ratio relating the unmeasured confounder U in the outcome, and RRAU relating any two exposure categories, kind of those attending weekly versus never, say to the unmeasured confounder, maybe it's personality high versus low on conscientiousness, for example, so that we've got two risk ratios. Then one can show that with an observed risk ratio of magnitude RR, that if both of those unmeasured confounder associations were at least as large as this E value, which is just the risk ratio plus the square root of the risk ratio times the risk ratio minus one. So you can do this with a hand calculator if you want, if you plug in, if you've got an observed risk ratio of 2, if religious service attendance, decreases um, depression by twofold as your estimate, then you plug in 2 here and you'd get a E value of 3.4, for example. If both of those unmeasured confounding associations were 3.4, then that could suffice to explain away that association, but weaker joint confounder associations could not. So you can kind of see how strong an unmeasured confounder would really have to be to explain away what one observes. So it's pretty easy to do this for the estimate for the limits of the confidence interval. You can do this by hand, but we also have an online e-value calculator. And there's more details in this tutorial paper in 2017. This approach has become quite popular in the 8 years since this was published. I think there are now over 5,000 published applications of this, but I think it can be helpful to assess our evidence. So as a brief example of this outcome-wide approach, one needs to take into account multiple testing as well, and maybe a Bonferroni correction would be useful here. But as an example of this approach, we looked at 3 different cohort studies of thousands, or in some cases with the nurses' health study, the middle study, tens of thousands of individuals, the health and retirement study, 13,000 individuals. And we looked at the associations of religious service attendance in 2010 with a whole host of outcomes in 2014, controlling for confounding variables and baseline outcomes in 2006, for example, in the health and retirement study, and then combined evidence over the 3 cohorts, the Growing Up Today study, the Nurses' Health study, which is the second column, and the Health and Retirement study. And the meta-analytic estimates are in these final columns: risk ratio in the 4th to last column, the standardized effect sizes in the 3rd to last, confidence intervals in the 2nd to last, and then the p-values in the 3rd to last. Those with 3 asterisks are passing 0.05 thresholds with Bonferroni correction, but we do provide exact p-values for these others as well. But one can see evidence for example, relatively strong effects on all-cause mortality, risk ratio of 0.74, 26% reduction, number of physical health problems, some of the health behaviors, heavy drinking and current smoking, about 30% reductions in each of those, protective effects on depression and depressive symptoms, anxiety, hopelessness, loneliness, and also psychological well-being, positive affect and happiness, life satisfaction, social integration, purpose in life. So in this one paper published in the International Journal of Epidemiology in 2020, we've advanced the literature on many of these topics. There had only been a handful of papers on longitudinal in design, on purpose in life, or on happiness, for example. So in a single paper, we've been able to advance our evidence. I think this is still kind of only input for meta-analyses, which I think is really what strengthens the evidence yet further, and what we're trying to do now. We can also kind of report e-values for these effects. So, for example, for the effect on all-cause mortality, we got an e-value in the 2nd to last column of 2, and that would mean to explain away our observed association between religious service attendance and lower all-cause mortality, we'd need an unmeasured confounder Personalities say that was associated with both twofold higher likelihood in religious service attendance and twofold lower likelihood in all-cause mortality. And it just, after control for a pretty rich set of measured confounders, it seems unlikely that that would be the case. Not definitive, but again, suggesting some robustness. And likewise, this table reports e-values for all of the other estimates as as well. Um, uh, so again, we're, I think, trying to expand the evidence base through these outcome-wide studies. I think their use by other investigators would likewise powerfully advance the evidence more quickly, because it's still the case that for some of these outcomes, purpose in life, for example, we perhaps only have a couple of rigorous longitudinal studies relating religious service attendance to these outcomes. So I think application of this outcome-wide approach would more quickly expand our evidence base. They'd serve as input for further meta-analyses of these longitudinal studies, and importantly, allow for the publication of null results as well. And we kind of saw, if we go back a slide, there were evidence for some null results. Religious service attendance didn't seem to have much effect on short sleep duration or frequency of physical activity or preventive healthcare use, for example, in these studies at least. So important to understand the null results as well. Likewise, only modest effect sizes for heart disease, cancer, overweight. So all of that does need to be used again as inputs to the meta-analyses, but I do think these outcome-wide studies can help. The other thing I think can help is incorporating flourishing measures into our studies, and we've been trying to do this. We now have a flourishing assessment looking at happiness and health and meaning in life and character and relationships and financial security in the nurses' health study data at Harvard, but really to try to advance this more quickly and more powerfully. We've now created, in collaboration with Gallup and with Baylor and Byron Johnson there, a new global flourishing study. And so this global flourishing study is a study of over 200,000 individuals in 22 different countries, representing about half the world's population, and with nationally representative sampling in each country. And we're following up the same group of 200,000 individuals once a year for 5 years. The first wave of this data was released in February of 2024. The second wave was just released in April of this year. This is a open access data resource, so anyone can make use of it by submitting a pre-registration to the Center for Open Science. And so while we've been making use of this and have published over 50 papers from this data already, we're making it available to the worldwide research community. But we're hoping to advance our understanding of flourishing and also the relationship between spirituality and religion and flourishing. We've embedded our flourishing measure with 2 questions each on 5 domains: happiness and life satisfaction. Those are the first 2 questions here: physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character, and close social relationships. The items and measures from this paper and the promotion of human flourishing, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2017. But the Global Flourishing Study includes not just these 10 well-being questions with 2 others on financial material security, but a whole host of other questions on well-being and the social, political, personality, communal, spiritual determinants. And so here's a whole list of the constructs that are available in this global flourishing study on various aspects of well-being, of health, of financial, economic situation, of quite a large list of religion and spirituality constructs, which I think will be helpful to look at over time. A number of assessments of relationships and community, number of assessments of character as well. Some of the key findings from this study are that young people in many countries are not doing so well. In some countries, flourishing is strictly increasing with age, including the United States, the UK, Australia, Argentina, Brazil. So I think this is a real issue and one that needs to be taken seriously. We've also seen that different countries are flourishing in different ways. Flourishing really is multidimensional. And so while rich developed countries do relatively high, well, in kind of financial security and overall life evaluation, they tend to be lower on meaning, on prosociality and character, on close relationships. Their middle income countries seem to be doing better. And then third, we've also seen that religious service attendance is strongly associated with health and well-being. In cross-sectional analyses, which again should not necessarily be interpreted causally, we see those attending more than once a week versus not at all have nearly a full point higher on flourishing on a 0 to 10 scale. We also in this study assessed a number of exposures retrospectively in childhood. How were things going at age 12, including religious service attendance at age 12. And so looking at associations between religious service attendance at age 12 and a host of flourishing outcomes while controlling for other age 12 exposures like health status and parent socioeconomic status and parent marital status and abuse and so on and so forth. One can kind of set up a synthetic longitudinal study, and we find that those attending at least once a week in childhood score about a quarter of a point higher in flourishing later in life, even after all of that measurement error. Um, and We can look at this separately across countries as well. We see while in pretty much every country there's either a beneficial association of flourishing or essentially a neutral one, the effect sizes really do vary. Very large effects, for example, in Poland and Japan, in Turkey, in Hong Kong, over half a point in flourishing and still present, but perhaps a little bit smaller in some of the other countries as well. This is just with the first wave of data, but now as the waves go on, we'll be able to look at associations between various aspects of religion and spirituality and numerous aspects of health, well-being, and flourishing over time. And if one goes back to that long list of religion and spirituality exposures as our second and our third wave of data become available, we'll be able to carry out longitudinal analyses for all of these different religious and spiritual exposures. So this data, combined with a rich set of religion and spirituality exposures and a rich set of well-being outcomes, and these outcome-wide designs, I think will help propel our evidence forward in this topic of religion, spirituality, and well-being. Now our time is limited, only 5 minutes left, so I'll just make a few high-level remarks with regard to um, uh, the implications of this work before opening it up for Q&A. I do think there are public health implications. We often assess public health impact as a function of the prevalence of the exposure and the size of its effect. And I think a compelling case can be made that religion and spirituality on these grounds constitute an important social determinant of health because 84% of the world's population report a religious affiliation. And it looks like that may be increasing. And we've seen evidence for effects of religious service attendance on health and well-being outcomes. So it's both common and has large effect sizes. It is shaping population health. And if we ignore this, we ignore trends in population health. If one looks at suicide, for example, and extrapolates the work on potentially causal associations between religious service attendance and lower suicide, it would suggest that of the increasing rates in suicide in the United States over 15 years, about 40% of that was perhaps due to declines in religious service attendance over that time. So this is a powerful force shaping population health. And if we ignore it, we're not understanding population health properly. So we need to take this seriously in public health. I think more difficult is what is the role in clinical practice? Should these matters be addressed? And this has been some subject of controversy. Influential editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2000 by Sloan and colleagues asked kind of should physicians prescribe religious activity, arguing that this is a crazy idea and really shouldn't be done. There was a response by Harold Koenig that same year saying, no one's saying prescribe religious activity, but that's different than understanding that this may be important in a patient's life and affect their decision making and provide support. And if someone's not religious, you can quickly move on to other discussion topics, but should at least inquire. And there were other responses from physicians saying, this has been really powerful in my role in patient care. We really should do this. Patients themselves report that this is important in their decision making. One study looking at cancer patients, said religion and spirituality out of 7 different factors in their decision making. Religion and spirituality were second most important of those 7 factors, whereas physicians rated it seventh out of 7. But we need to take, patients' ways of thinking into account. And so, there have been various spiritual history assessments proposed, which I think are good. They're probably too long to be used in practice. So what we've proposed instead is 2 very simple questions that can be used, say, in serious illness um, settings. Are religion and spirituality important to you in thinking about health and illness or at other times? Do you have someone, or would you like to have someone to talk to about spiritual matters? And these questions can be asked even if patients and clinicians view religious matters differently, because one can refer the patient to a chaplain or social worker or a pastor if they want to talk further. The clinician doesn't have to do this, but should at least ask and inquire whether this is important. Um, I think more controversially is this question, should, in any sense, religious community participation be encouraged? And I think one has to be careful here. People don't make decisions about religion based on health typically, and religious commitments are shaped by, experiences, upbringing, values, truth claims, evidence, relationships, systems of meaning. Um, uh, but for those who do already positively self-identify with a religious tradition, um, it might be reasonable to encourage service attendants, to encourage participation in religious communities as a meaningful form of social participation. You're not saying become religious for health. You're saying you already hold these beliefs. Given the evidence that we have on the role of religious community in health and well-being, might you consider joining a community, given you already have these commitments? I do think context is important, and issues of negative experiences or even abuse need to be addressed. But I think taking a spiritual history can kind of help uncover some of those negative experiences as well. So what we've proposed in the commentary in the American Journal of Epidemiology is trying to find a sensitive and ethical way to bring these matters into healthcare. And so what we proposed, in part in response to that 2000 New England Journal of Medicine commentary arguing that this should be completely out, is that one should first begin with spiritual history, 2 relatively neutral questions on, is religion and spirituality important to you? Would you like to have someone, or do you have someone to talk to about these matters? So after a brief spiritual history, for those who do already positively self-identify with a religious tradition, clinician could encourage attendance since they already hold these beliefs. And for those who do not hold religious convictions, you can encourage other forms of community participation. The effects on health and well-being are perhaps not quite as large for other forms of community participation, but still meaningful. So encourage religious participation for those who are religious in the community, encourage other forms of community participation for those who are not. And for those who have had negative past experiences, one could refer those patients, if they so desire, to chaplains or counselors to help work through some of those difficulties. There might still be skepticism around this proposal, but if so, I think we can turn the question around also. Given that the effects of attendance, of religious service attendance, of community participation on so many health and well-being outcomes are so profound, and I would argue, given that we know there are effects on all-cause mortality and depression, given that we've established knowledge at this point, if we don't do this, are we doing harm by withholding this information? That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and happy to take comments, questions, and critiques, but really pleasure being with you here today.
Thank you so much, Professor VANDERWEELE, for giving us such a impactful presentation and sharing. And thank you so much for taking the lead in attacking this very, very difficult question, big question that comes with so many difficulties at the same time. So again, as a chair, I'll ask the first question. I was pondering about your conceptualization or understanding of this very complex construct of religion and spirituality. And you're talking about doing meta-analyses across many different studies, across different cultures. So how do you approach this construct, which can be defined so differently across different cultures?
Yeah, yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a good question. And um, uh, I would say my understanding of the construct of religion and of spirituality is indeed broad and complex and quite all encompassing. The definitions we had put forward in the third edition of the handbook and on religion and health were something along the lines of the following. I'm not sure I'm going to get it precisely right word for word, but it was essentially that religion is understood as a system of beliefs and practices that unite adherents into a community uh, with a shared pursuit of the experience of or union with the divine or transcendent. So that was our proposed construct definition for religion. System of beliefs and practices uniting adherents into a community with a shared vision for either union with or experience of either the divine or the transcendent. And I think it works pretty well in capturing the variation we see across the world religions. Then spirituality was something along the lines of an individual's set of beliefs, practices, and ways of being intended to attain experience of or union with the divine or transcendent. So a little bit more individually focused, extending to um, ways of being as well. And again, I think that helps capture the diversity in spiritual practices around the world. Now, we can't measure that construct in its entirety. What we can do, however, is assess aspects of it. And so, I think where we can make progress empirically is to look at participation in religious community, or practices of prayer, or practices of meditation, or particular beliefs, belief in God, belief in life after death. Um, and so there's no way to comprehensively measure religion, but we can measure aspects of it, and then we can look for evidence of causation between the specific aspects or facets of religion and spirituality and health and well-being.
Thank you. That's insightful. I think that's important. And it provides guidance for our research and also practical implications. I'll save my other questions to some other time, but and give the floor to the audience. Are there any questions? Kirk, you look like you have a question. Thank you, Professor Bingaman.
Thank you, Tyler, for excellent presentation. Yesterday, I talked about religion, spirituality, and in the context of a digital world. And I wonder to what extent do you, Harold, et al., situate this in the findings of researchers that support what you said earlier, like in the developed world, um, there's a decline in well-being, right, and meaning. And I even pointed out yesterday a Baylor University study that talks about um, online activity and increasing the what they call spiritual tinkering,
Mhm.
quote unquote. So um, there's so many options, right? And um, there's tinkering. There's less embrace of a particular tradition, right?
Yeah.
So I hear what you're saying. It's very important. Uh, right. The data are in on
Yeah.
attendance, situated in religious community, faith community, And yet, in the world in which we're living, it seems to be running counter to that in a lot of ways. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts
Yeah.
on that contextualization.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. And, obviously, what I've presented today is situated in a much more complex set of forces that are shaping well-being and shaping religion and spirituality as well. I'll just make maybe a few brief remarks with regard to, yeah, how I see um, uh, our digital age shaping both religion, spirituality, and health and well-being. I mean, I think it's evidence is pretty compelling that at least excessive or substantial engagement with sort of digital social media does lead and has led to declines in well-being. And I do think it's not the whole source of the declines in well-being amongst youth, but I think one of several forces that has led to those declines in youth, and perhaps especially prominent for girls and young women, but I think have had effects on boys and young men as well. So I think that's one of the forces that's led to decline and well-being amongst youth. I do think the declining rates of religious service attendance has also amongst young people has also been a factor in the declining well-being of youth. In the United States, at least that trend, I think just last year began to reverse. But I do think that has been an influence as well. Um, and I do think, as you were saying, the digital age has in some ways led to some of those declines in religion and spirituality. Other forces at play, unquestionably, as well. But that notion of spiritual tinkering has probably led to withdrawal, and has also led to when people do participate, perhaps more online forms of participation in religious life. And while I wouldn't say we have anywhere close to definitive evidence on this, the studies we've carried out on this has suggested much weaker effects of digital religious service attendance than in-person attendance. Maybe not entirely absent, but a whole lot weaker. So that virtual forms of participation, don't seem as powerful. And then, I guess the last remark I would make is I do think while there can be a role for, exploration of different faith traditions, and while I do think in some ways our greater access to knowledge is good, I do think if one wants to realize the richness of religious life and religious community, particular commitments are needed. While we do find associations with other aspects of religion, spirituality, and health and well-being, they're generally the effect sizes are a lot smaller than that of in-person religious service attendance. It's that commitment to the community, showing up every week, being and participating in those traditions that sort of shape so many different aspects of one's life and creates a sense of community for oneself. And I think that combination of community with the values and that transcendent pursuit are really what has these profound effects on health and well-being. So I think the tinkering does pose some danger to not having that commitment and that rich experience of the religious traditions of particular communities.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you for that response. I think that relates to one of the comments or question from our online participants asking about religious practices at home or alone. Are there good effects still? Or so I think I take it that they may still be helpful, but the effects are much reduced. And would you say that the effects of like face-to-face and participation, in-person participation, like you all, are these stronger effects explained by the social support or just personal engagement or
Yeah.
other factors? Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try to take those one by one. First, on private aspects of religion and spirituality. Again, I think the effect sizes are weaker, but I think there is evidence that for something like prayer and meditation, at least modest effects on well-being and depression and maybe anxiety. I mean, interestingly enough, with religious service attendance, one doesn't find much with anxiety. Yes, with depression, yes, with suicide, but not much with anxiety. And prayer and meditation may be more important there. But generally, the effect sizes for private spirituality are weaker than religious community. Why are these effects there? Again, I think it's many different mechanisms. Social support is certainly one of them, but it only explains maybe a quarter of the effect on all-cause mortality. There are others as well. And so I think, yes, it's social, but it's also spiritual. And I think it's the coming together of the social and the spiritual, the community and the faith that's giving these religious communities their powerful effects on health and well-being. And then, finally, what about online participation? Again, the effect sizes tend to be weaker. Sometimes this was necessary during the pandemic, for example. And um, I think those online forms of participation in some ways helped sustain the life of these communities so that they could reemerge post pandemic, for example, and were meaningful forms of participation in and of themselves with both private practices and, say, online participation. I mean, it's enabling one's religious and spiritual life. And for many of these religious traditions, it's sort of that aiming for the transcendent that's ultimately most important, not you know, uh, health and well-being at the present time. So I think both private practices and, when necessary, the online forms of participation are and were really important in sustaining spiritual life and the life of these communities. But now that we can participate face to face, once again, I think the evidence really does suggest that in-person participation, that bringing together of the social and the religious, is really what's giving these communities their powerful effects on health and well-being.
Thank you. Thank you for that very comprehensive response. Are there other questions? Our time is up, but if Professor Vanderwill is okay, we'll see if there's one or two more quick questions. No? Okay, that will be our last question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing the talk and also very useful, resourceful statistics model and all the resources as well. For those who are like attending religious activities online, digital form, virtual. Although I understood that there's a reduced effect there on mental health and like the health well-being. But then would there be moderators? Like would there be like some potential moderators like for the reduced changes? Because as I know, like some people who go to church or Catholic religious people, they don't want to be bothered by people, like they just want to go and then pray and then leave and then not much social support that they need. So I'm just saying that some people, so I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I don't know about moderators specifically for online attendance, but some of the moderators that have emerged, again, mostly in the research carried out in the West for the effects of religious community in general in health and well-being, have been gender and race, in fact. And well, perhaps not entirely definitive, one tends to find larger effects of religious service attendance on health and well-being for women over men, beneficial for both, but larger effects for women. Likewise, one finds larger effects, tends to find larger effects for Black individuals attending religious services over white individuals. Again, protective and beneficial for both, but larger effects for Black communities. And my speculation, and again, I don't have definitive evidence on this, but sort of looking over the literature, I think a lot of what's going on is sort of what does it mean to attend services weekly? And I think to your point, some people just want to go and depart, and I think there's still benefits to doing that. But I think women are more likely than men when they attend services to actually spend more time there, to perhaps help with Sunday school for the children beforehand, and then go to the service, and then help with the church potluck, for example. And so it might be a 3-hour experience rather than a 1-hour experience. And I tend to think that's what's driving the difference in effect sizes for men and women. It's sort of, what does weekly service attendance mean? Obviously, there are men who do that as well, but there is a difference if one simply looks at what typically takes place in churches in the United States, for example. Likewise, I think with the Black churches, often attending a church service is almost a whole day affair. Longer services, sometimes multiple services, long church meals, community gatherings. It might be 5 or 6 hours in total rather than just one. And so that deepens those social ties further. That's further reinforcing of the values and the purposes, further times of joint prayer, for example, further opportunities for spiritual experiences or trying to experience the transcendent, a deepening of both the relationships and um, of faith practices. And so I tend to think what's going on with those moderators of gender and race is it's kind of capturing the extent of the participation in the experience. Again, I'm not certain of that, but that's what I tend to think is what's going on in the data. But again, if that interpretation's right, it points to, once again, the importance of participation.
Okay, I think that concludes our session really well. Thank you so much, Professor VANDERWEELE, for spending the last hour with us with these very important insights. Your flourishing model has definitely advanced our team's research, and we look forward to more findings from the Global Flourishing Study. All the best to your study as well.
Wonderful.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
And thank you. It
Thank
really
you.
was a
Thank
pleasure
you.
being with you all
Thank you.
today. And I
Thank
hope the rest
you.
of the conference
Thank
goes
you.
very well indeed. But thank you all again.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you.